Welcome to today's webinar, Exposure-Based Safety and the Impact of COVID-19. My name is Dane Armendariz. I'm an industry manager for Chemetall BASF and the technical advisor for the Wire Association International. I will be your moderator today. This program is being recorded and will be available within a few days on the WAI archives and on YouTube. At this point, I'm pleased to recognize the following sponsors of today's program: Encore Wire Corporation, Gem Gravure Company Incorporated, James Monroe Wire and Cable Corporation, SDI Lafarga Copper Works, South Wire Company LLC, and Wire and Plastic Machineries. We have a few housekeeping items to review about the Zoom interface before we begin. You can click the audio settings button to switch to a different audio option. If you have joined the meeting using computer audio, be sure to select Leave Computer Audio before dialing in to the meeting by telephone. Click on the Leave Meeting button when ready. If you do leave, you can rejoin the webinar if it is still in progress. Zoom has a chat panel that you can use to send a private message to a single person by clicking the down arrow in the To field and by selecting the person's name. Or you can send your message to everyone attending the webinar. Today's format will include a brief question and answer segment at the end of the presentation. However, please type in your questions at any time, so we're ready to begin when we get to that point. To ask a question, click the Q&A button, type your question, and send. You will have the option to send your questions anonymously if you like. Answers will either be shown in this panel or answered live. Now it is my great pleasure to introduce our presenters, Kevin Burg and Brian Holzaepfel of Charter Steel, who will highlight the company's journey to exposure-based safety, including the application, adoption, successes, and challenges. They will share how this program adapted to the COVID-19 global pandemic and the adjustments that were made to ensure sustainability. Kevin Burg is the Director of Safety for Charter Steel, where he is responsible for leading safety management systems, worker compensation management, and loss prevention efforts. He has worked at Charter Steel in progressive safety roles for 16 years. He holds a Master's of Science degree in Occupational Safety and Health from the University of Whitewater, Wisconsin. Brian Holzaepfel is the Operation Manager for Charter Steel, where he is responsible for the processing at both the Wisconsin and Ohio operations. He was previously the plant manager and before that the production manager at the Fostoria facility. He holds a mechanical engineering degree from Ohio University and an MBA from Bowling Green. He has more than 20 years of manufacturing experiences. And at this point, I will turn it over to Brian to begin the presentation.
Hello, everybody. It's our pleasure to give a little bit of background about what exposure-based safety is and how we were able to apply it to a reasonably significant operations of Charter Steel and leverage that as we actually transitioned into the impacts of COVID-19. It actually served as the baseline for our response to the pandemic and allowed us to really react reasonably quickly to ensure the safety of all of our employees. Just a little bit of overview about Charter Steel, a large steel manufacturing organization, carbon and alloy steel, wire rod, roughly 1.3 million tons annually, 150 employees spread out over three specific locations between Saukville, Wisconsin, Cleveland, Ohio, and Fostoria, Ohio. Industries. Obviously, we cover a wide range of industries with the product line. Traditionally, the vast majority of ours are in mobile industry. So some of the tighter ones with automotive, heavy truck, construction, mining. Over this past year, we actually started up our SBQ mill as well in the Cleveland site. And we're able to take a lot of the implications of exposure-based safety and apply that to that new startup of that new rolling mill as well. So as we look not only at our existing assets and capabilities and capacities and processes, we look at embedding these in future as we continue to grow as an organization. think at this point, most are familiar with the steel making process, but really dovetails into a lot of the conversation. Everything starts in an arc furnace. The electric arc furnace melts and converts scrap steel roughly 100 tons at a time, dealing with roughly 3,000, about 3,100 degree temperature molten steel that's being transferred to a caster. That caster then takes that refined alloyed and purified steel and transitions that into direct cast billet, some concast billet of square orientation geometries. From there, the square billets are converted to round bar to the rolling mill, varying in sizes from 7/32 to 1 9/16 inches. Our SBQ line goes up to 3.5 inch round bars direct off the mill as well. Transferred into a coil, which should look familiar to a lot of people on this webinar. Once that coil comes down to temperature, it is then either shipped directly to customers as green coil or sent on for secondary processing at our processing plants. Coils are then cleaned in acid, get the scale off, coated with lubricant, can go through subsequent heat treating, drawing, lots of different processes depending on the customer needs. And the reason on the background of all of these slides is not necessarily to tell you exactly how steel is made, but as we take a look at all of our organizations and everybody on this from an operations perspective, every single one of these areas has hazards. And traditionally, as we look at whether it's molten steel at 3,000 degrees, highly moving equipment of a rolling mill, the acid involved with the pickling lines, or even just the ambient temperatures of the steel, whether it's through annealing or subsequent processing and all that equipment. Hazards exist in our operations and we deal with those each and every day. And as we transitioned into this program, the focus really was on acknowledging that hazards can exist, but we can work safely around those, and finding those means to mitigate those hazards is part of the baseline of this exposure-based program. Just because a hazard exists does not mean that a workplace is unsafe. And that was a key acknowledgement that we needed to work through as an organization as we transitioned into this program. Specifically for Charter Steel, I think one of the things that enabled us to transition quickly and well is just our overall culture. And I think everybody's proud of their organizational culture. I've had the opportunity to work in several organizations, and really what I feel about culture in Charter is it truly is this one family, one team mindset with the owner base that is firmly rooted in those core values where people do care and need to care about each other each and every day to make that environment safe. A long-term strategy, vision, and a lot of passion for CI is just embedded in the core of train our employees and how we expect them to operate each and every day. Flat and nimble organization lets us adapt quickly. And the focus is really beyond compliance. As we looked at the programs and really what's important to us, we all are obligated to deal with our exposure, our recordables, our SIF, the things that we need to document and deal with our organizations outside as we deal with OSHA and compliance expectations and regulation. But that wasn't the focus of the safety program. And as Kevin gets into really imperative that we think beyond just what we need to do to tick the boxes per se, and really think about how we want to shift that culture in that safety program. Our core values really do hone in on that as we look at trust, teamwork, safety, and continuous improvement.
Thanks, Brian, and thank you for the opportunity to share our story and our journey in safety. The first slide I wanted to share here is our injury rates over time. I started with Charter Steel in 2005. We had double-digit injury rates. And through some programs, policies, and overall focus on compliance, primarily compliance, we were able to drive that number down over the years. But back in 2017, we started having conversations around reaching a plateau. That plateau was about half the industry average in terms of injury type rate. but we wanted to be better. And we wanted some help in regards to what that looked like. How do we focus efforts? And what is our next steps in our journey? Next slide, Brian. We partnered with a consultant group called DECRA Insight. And DECRA came in and looked at our programs, looked at our policies, interviewed the management team, employees, as well as performed a safety survey. And they called it an organizational diagnostic instrument, essentially, but it's a safety survey. And they took a look at our scores across management scales and compared them to other organizations that did well in safety, and made a number of recommendations across the organization to improve those scores, which would improve our lagging indicators, our safety results, so to speak. We spent a lot of time and energy and effort in regards to this process because we're a data-driven organization. And we got agreement on a number of programs, initiatives across Charter Steel to implement to improve our culture of safety. Next slide, Brian. One of those areas was the focus on exposure. And this was a little different in terms of a definition for me in regards to exposure. There's two definitions up there that I'll have you read through, hazard and exposure. But essentially, the focus is on exposure because it's more proactive. DECRA said that we were too focused on recordable rate, injury rates, and what they call lagging indicators. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because you have to evaluate the result, but we wanted to be more proactive. So the focus was in areas of exposure assessment, identification, frontline leader identification, coaching, as well as SIF. There's a number of other activities that we did, but Brian and I are going to focus on that exposure connection today. Next slide, Brian. So essentially what exposure is it's when our employees or people intersect with that hazard. And this is important to understand because it is proactive, and that's how you control exposure around reducing or eliminating. So DECRA's highlight here is, again, you're too focused on the lagging indicator. You need to improve your identification of exposure and control that exposure. One of the things that we did at Charter was actually redefined safety as an organization. And we defined safety as controlling exposure for yourself and others. And that really drives all our activities and our programs in moving forward. I'll highlight some of these in a moment. But overall, I thought this was a really good marketing and branding to our employees, because safety is not just being injured. Safety is controlling exposure. Next slide, Brian. A subset of exposure, a type of exposure, is SIF. SIF is a type of exposure that has greater potential that could cause serious injury and fatality. You may be aware of Heinrich's pyramid. Heinrich developed this in the 1930s, I believe, after he evaluated over 75,000 injuries. And the principle behind Heinrich's hierarchy is that for every 300 near misses, for instance, you're going to have one major injury. I learned this back in college. So when I went out to my first job, we were focusing on all those near misses and minor injuries to prevent any more significant type injuries. But a new theory in data points to a different triangle, a triangle inside a triangle. There you go. The triangle inside the triangle is about potential SIF. So there's low frequency, high potential events rather that could occur that you really want to go after. An example that we used internally is an employee steps on a rock and twists their ankle. And it's diagnosed with a sprain. It's just first aid, okay? And that would fit in the triangle in terms of that middle category of a minor injury, a first aid type injury. In the second incident for evaluation is an employee is almost struck by a forklift while moving out of the way, and he sprains his ankle. That second incident has more potential than the first incident, although the outcome is the same. So what DECRA showed us and taught us is that you need to go after the ones that have more potential, regardless of what they fall in to a category as an outcome. We call that proportional response. And classifying proportional response is important in the SIF process to focus your efforts and reduce that overall exposure and focus in on SIF exposure. Next slide. The additional narrative here is that in the industry across many organizations is that we have seen a decline in recordable rate, but the fatalities have not decreased over time. So are we focusing on the right things in the industry? And I think this applies across the steel industry and many industries where you have more SIF potential. So some additional narrative and data that we need to be going after those high potential events. Next slide. So this is a question that I asked my division leadership team a few years back when we rolled out the SIF process. If Charter Steel had one recordable injury in that year, would we be excellent in safety? About half of the managers raised their hand and said, yeah, we would be excellent. That's great. That's world class. And then I asked the group, what if I told you that one recordable was a fatality or a significant life-altering permanent injury? All those hands went down. So it changes the perspective of that focus and what we want to go after as an organization. It's not that we accept the small recordable injuries. We're going to attack those as well, but our focus should really be around preventing those SIF events. Next slide. So I just want to share a little bit about our overall SIF process. There's a lot more detail behind this slide, a lot of activity behind this slide as well. So feel free to reach out to me if you want more information in each of these areas. But we classified and wrote a program for determination and response planning for SIF to drive forward that proportional response. So if we identified something in our system that had SIF potential, we're going to spend more energy and effort in going after to prevent that from reoccurring. We have additional metrics and dashboards to help us drive SIF forward and reduce that exposure. We also did an education campaign with our employees. We went out and did a baseline assessment with our employees around what is SIF and what are some SIF potentials in your area to really raise that awareness. So we got some good data and good action items out of that as well. We introduced the concepts across the organization, developed a SIF video. What is SIF? What is the definition across the organization of SIF, and what can really what can we really get after in that area as well? We also integrated some concepts into our system to help us sustain the SIF principle and ideas and programs. So we improved our iCare system, which is our incident and corrective action reporting system. So all incidents that go in that system, we can classify SIF by checking a box at the plant manager level, which sends out a notification to groups of individuals that a SIF has occurred and share that incident for corrective and preventative action. We also identified a top SIF by area, by plant, and went after those areas that had potential shift. And I'll share an example later on that as well. We also focused on crane activities across the organization. We saw a lot of data and incidents come through in regards to SIF potential when operating a crane. So we had a process for that. We also integrated SIF into our smart manufacturing process, where we want to eliminate and engineer out those activities that could I guess, produce SIF events, so to speak. Next slide, Brian. So here's our definition of SIF at Charter Steel. And basically, it's an event that could be life-altering or life-threatening. Now, we use the term SIF that includes SIF potential and also SIF actual. We classify each in terms of our lagging data, but SIF basically we communicate as life-altering or life-threatening event. Next slide. So to drive additional proportional response, I had mentioned this earlier, but we've enhanced our iCare system. So here's some snapshots of a SIF notification. So this notification goes out to plant managers and managers that a SIF has occurred. So they can, again, share the event and probe if this could apply in their areas. And we've really enhanced the communication around incidents and events that have occurred with this methodology. We also have that SIF button that for data indicates that it has occurred, so we can evaluate, chart, and analyze that data as well. To drive proportional response, we've also implemented focus teams, what we call the cause analysis team, the CAT team, and we actually have a SIF CAT team by area, which is a higher level of individuals that need to get together to evaluate and look for corrective and preventive actions to prevent reoccurrence. We've added the additional questions for SIF in that system for evaluation as well, to ensure that we're consistently evaluating engineering controls, for instance, and driving up that hierarchy of controls, so to speak, to prevent that reoccurrence as well. So some elements of proportional response that we've implemented within our systems. So here's some snapshots of the data that we're using. We're continuing to use and enhance across the organization to focus efforts to plan for engineering controls and elimination, also raise awareness at the employee level of where the incidents are occurring, what we need to focus on in terms of observations, safety team risk reductions, exposure reductions. So it's a nice set of data that we're utilizing to go after SIF. So let's talk about some of the results that we've seen so far. We've seen an overall reduction of crane incidents in regards to SIF events. And that really goes back to our process of identifying that we have causes and correlates around crane operation and reducing the exposure with engineering controls, awareness, training, and feedback out on the floor. A great success story as well is the prevention of forklift rollaways or pull-offs when loading trucks. In 2017 and 2018, we had about 25 incidents, and we're down to 2 incidents for this year based on our engineering controls to prevent that type of rollaway. We used to have more on the operation control side around dock locks and chalk systems. We found better systems. It's really pushed the organization to find better systems overall, but a better system that locks in that truck and trailer to prevent those pullaways. So a great story to tell there. And we expect 0 incidents once we implement this system across all sites and all plants. We've seen a reduction overall of severity rate. That's primarily the number of lost days per event that has occurred in the SIF actual category. We've had a few setbacks more recently, but overall, we're trending in the right direction in regards to severity rate. Our SIF percentage of events that have occurred has decreased as well. A good story to tell there. Also, we've seen an increase of incident reporting, and I have this green. It is a 140% increase, and some may say, well, wow, you're having more incidents. I don't believe that. I believe we're reporting more incidents. So that helps us as well. We have a better data set. We know what to go after in SIF, and we're getting good corrective and preventative actions for all those incidents. What Decker said is, you've had a lot of underreporting in the past for a number of reasons. But you could tell that we've established a new baseline around incident reporting. So I was asked one time, how many reports do you think you should be getting? I said, all of them. There's not a magic number. You have to encourage reporting. You have to remove those roadblocks to reporting, and you need to report and show that you're following up with those incidents to prevent reoccurrence. Next slide.
Slide's mine.
Okay.
But I wanted to take an opportunity. I think as we talk a lot about the programs, programs are the I guess the foundation and the framework for a safety organization. But at the end of the day, it does come down to culture and how we embrace how we're applying these protocols and these systems. I think for me, when I saw the turning point as we looked at SIF and potential SIF, and Kevin talked a lot about the actual occurrence versus maybe the severity with the ankle sprain. There's one that stands out in my mind as we had an operator that came across a electrical cord, was arcing in a puddle because we had a garage door open. I'm sure we're the only organization that opens every garage door during the summer, but a rainstorm had come through and there was an electrical cord on the floor and it had been arcing. Employee unplugged it, actually flagged it, worked with the supervisor, and we were early on in this journey, in this transition over. But the normal, I think, response, if we'd looked at this about 5 years ago or 10 years ago, would have been take the extension cord, throw it away, get a new one, plug it in, and keep going. The response from the CAT investigation was, hey, that had the potential to be serious if the employee would have walked into that puddle during the arcing of that cord. Not only did we question why we were running extension cords in the first place, but we also looked throughout the organization, throughout the site that it occurred for our GFCIs, and then also across all the organization to make sure as we were buying extension cords, do we get that integrated into the cords at the beginning to address that exposure and that potential hazard moving forward. So to me, that was a turning point on the culture, cascaded not only across our division of Charter Steel, but was also shared out throughout the rest of manufacturing as a whole.
Thanks, Brian. One other example that I'd like to share as far as management focus is that whole concept of proportional response and the questions we ask as leaders. And Decker pointed out in an event that occurred in terms of a foreign body in the eye that happened to be recordable because of a prescription, for instance, no permanency and no permanent damage. In the past, I think we'd only ask around that was a recordable. What happened? What are you doing about it? And yet we would drop a crane load, right, that had SIF potential, and there might not be any questions at a higher level around that event. Now we're asking questions more so on dropping the crane load because of the potential of a fatality versus the foreign body in the eye. Again, not that we're not going to go after that, but the questions that management asks are important in regards to giving overall direction and our focus as an organization. So another example as well.
We look at how we applied the shift to exposure based in that focus. A lot of this came through from laying the groundwork with the people that were most important as we took a step at how do we address this from a culture? How do we enhance this? How do we start this process from day one? Really started with our frontline leaders, and that supervisor level is probably the most difficult level of any organization. That balance between operator and management and the expectations, but really they have the ability to have the most influence to define the culture and the expectations for the organization from a safety standpoint. Started with substantial amount of training with the frontline, how they show up, defining safety, defining exposure as Kevin went through, talking a lot about the why and why we're shifting our focus, why we're changing that purview to be more based on that exposure and hazard action. One of the techniques that we do apply is what's called a safety contact. Again, just focusing again on that culture, that interaction from an operator standpoint, That one-on-one conversation with a frontline leader with a very intentional, I'm going to go look at the banding station in Fostoria. And I'm going to go watch the operators, make sure they're following their safe work practices, make sure they're following the safety guidelines that we have established, and then have a conversation about safety and make it normal to have a safety. Lots of different organizations have a different response when you go talk to an operator about safety. We just wanted that to be a normal expectation across all of Charter Steel, that safety is just normal, as if you were asking what the score of the football game was this past weekend. So the frontline leader goes and has this conversation. What we were able to do is not only typically ask about the hazards or the exposures in their area from the banding tools or the equipment or the ergonomics. When COVID came about, we used this as an opportunity to continue that and focus in on the exposure of COVID. How do we ensure social distancing? How do we ensure we have the right protocols in place? Because quite frankly, our operators typically have a better idea of solving the issues than we do. So we talk about transition questions or open-ended questions to make sure that we're gaining that feedback and having that interaction. And with COVID, we viewed COVID just as another exposure. So that was another hazard. How do we prevent that exposure from occurring? So questions like, what is your greatest COVID exposure and what are you doing about it? So again, imploring the employee to be owning their own safety as well. Are we missing anything, or is there any room for improvement on what we could do at the end of shift, disinfecting or sanitizing? Trying to solicit some feedback along the way to make sure that we were, number one, offering as much protection as we could for our employees, but also not missing a great opportunity for some of that candid feedback. That CI is still a core aspect of the organization. One of the other tools that we use is called an exposure alert. These occur when we want to share something that took place, where we've run through a CAT or we've run through a cause analysis team, and then share out with the rest of the organization to make sure that we don't have the same thing occur anywhere else. So we have six operating plants and 3 warehouse and shipping areas across 3 separate sites. So we've got a lot of different organizations, and it would be a shame and it would be unfortunate for us as managers if we could have stopped something from happening because we just didn't communicate it. So we got into a practice of highlighting key exposures and then sharing them across the organization. This is an example of one that was sent out in April of this year, really focusing in on social distancing, ensuring that we're defining that expectation, staying 6 feet apart, what is required as far as an operator, at all times, when you're in your operating pulpit on the shop floor next to the draw machine, whatever that is, trying to make sure that we have that social distancing taken care of. Taping or mapping areas. We did a lot, and we covered a lot previously during a webinar about a lot of the changes that all organizations needed to do to respond to COVID to ensure that social distancing. But this was early on in April, trying to get ahead of it, identifying the hazards and really sharing out with the operators, and then communicated our shift stand down meetings. They used this as a leverage tool at our toolbox talks to communicate to every shift, every operator coming back onto the site. Here's the risk, here's the exposure, and here's what we have in place to ensure that we mitigate that risk. From a leadership standpoint, as we looked at COVID as an exposure, we changed some protocols. We changed our auditing. I'm sure every organization has multiple layers of auditing, whether it's for quality, whether it's for safety, whether it's for quality systems as a whole. We put it in place for our audits to control our COVID exposure. So we put in a system in place. We allocated out key managers to focus in on that and really garner some feedback on, are we adhering to the occupancy limits? Are they defined? Are the signs up on the offices? Are the signs up on the pulpits? Sanitizing, do we have the right equipment in the right location for all the operators? Are we signing off on the cleaning logs to make sure that we have traceability, that if we do have a positive and we're doing the contact tracing, that we can verify that we've cleaned that area subsequently after that person was there. Disinfecting logs as well. So what we saw back in week 36, as you show on the graph here, The conformancy got from, call it mid 80s up to close to 100% in week 45. The completion rate of the audits has tailed off, and as an ops guy, I can take ownership for that. But the response of what we were seeing was good. We wanted to make sure that what we had put in place to protect everybody was valid. The protocols were being adhered to, mask wearing was being done, and the social distancing was being done. As we went into COVID and we talked about exposures and hazards and the social distancing, I think the other neat thing was how, as an organization, we rethought our tasks and our jobs. Where do you need to be within 6 feet of somebody to do your job? And, how do you get to a more social environment, socially distant organization in a manufacturing world? Some sites, some operations, that was easier than others, but it was a nice way for us to rethink how we did our daily tasks and really put the onus on the operators and our supervisors to kind of rethink, how do we make sure that we protect everybody and keep all of our employees safe while they're within charter? Had to rethink how we do a lot of things, and every organization's adapting very quickly to this remote environment, as we're all here on a webinar, whether it's WebEx or Teams or any other format. We try to leverage some of that technology as well, because we do need to maintain our safety training. Done a lot of stuff with new hire orientation through virtual training, through Teams, to make sure that nobody has to be in the same conference room periods of time from an exposure standpoint. Some of our required training did not stop with COVID. You think about our standard electrical training, some of our compliance training that needed to get conducted for EMRs, for our first responder program. They need to continue that training regardless of COVID. They need to be able to get their hours. They need to be able to get their refresher training. We had to do things a little different. We separated, we adhered to our requirements for a number of participants in a single room. We did across the same training across 3 or 4 different rooms simultaneously cast to make sure that we could get that training done. We've leveraged things like learning management system for compliance training, where individually you can go on, watch the video, interact, answer some questions pertaining to lockout, tagout, or some of those programs that we do need to make sure that we're maintaining that, not only from a compliance standpoint, but also from a skill set from an operator standpoint. So just learning to use the technology to help support things a little bit differently in today's world. And Kevin showed a little bit of highlight. We've been leveraging a software called Tableau, generates some fantastic reports to be able to trace where our exposures are, where our risks are. I talked about safety contacts previously. A lot of that comes back from the data that we're capturing from actual occurrences. So from all this reporting that Kevin alluded to, that's all going into a system that's telling us, where do we need to focus as managers, as supervisors? Where should my next safety contact take place? How do I go out and talk to the area of exposure, whether that's mobile equipment, whether that's a certain area in the organization that's showing a heightened SIF potential? We do need to redeploy our organization there to be able to support and help reduce that exposure. It's leveraging the tools holistically to be able to approach all the sites across Charter Steel to reduce that severity standpoint.
Well said, Brian. In regards to sustainability of the programs overall, we have oversight and a term we use in governance, I would say, of each of the programs that we are keeping our finger on the pulse of. And some need a little more attention than others, but we have a operations safety team, we call the OST, that is oversight and a check and balance in each of these areas. So we'll be reviewing the health and discussion around how's it going, beyond the data. What's the narrative? What's the narrative, and how are employees embracing these programs? How are we engaging our workforce out there as well? So it's important in regards to not having the flavor of the day type program too, that we're committed to these areas. We've had a lot of change in the last couple of years in safety and initiatives and programs. So we need to make sure that we're supporting these programs, supporting the individuals that are out in the front line executing to these programs and initiatives overall. And we've got a system for that in different layers as well. In the future for SIF, what we have on our radar is called field verification of controls. And that's really a sustainability element where we're going out into the field as trained auditors looking specifically at SIF and what behaviors must be present to prevent SIF, especially when you're focusing on operational controls and how to operate a crane, how to operate the mobile equipment when you can't engineer out all those hazards. So looking for those specific exposures, giving feedback, and then getting additional data there too. So just to share that it's an important element when you roll out any type of initiative or program is to have that sustainability. And I think we're set up very well for the future into 2021.
Wow. I want to thank you, gentlemen, for this. This was a very informative presentation. And I like the way you did it from the beginning of your program and how you brought it forward. We do have a number of questions. And I just wanted to say that I enjoyed learning about the SIF program, the SIF program, and the proportional response. That was a great example where you talk about, I can step on a rock and twist my ankle, or I can jump out of the way of a forklift truck and twist my ankle. Are they the same? Well, certainly not. And that's a good way to look at these kind of near misses. And let's get to a question here. Let's see. How are the workers accepting the change in plant life? Because there's probably been a lot.
I'll take that one, Kevin. I would say plant life from COVID. We've seen a wide range of accepting the changes. I think early on, we talked about our COVID response. We phased in our employees to protect our employees. So all non-essential personnel, and I hate to use that term, but our CEO flagged himself as non-essential, so I'll use that term, took themselves out of the organization for several months as we tried to understand what this pandemic meant. So there was a little bit of freedom, so to speak, from an ops perspective, from an operator standpoint. I think they adapt well. We've got a really good workforce that has seen the opportunities to kind of look at their job tasks differently, to be able to flex differently. I think as we look at COVID as a whole and the strain it's put on all of America and globally, quite frankly, from a manufacturing standpoint, yeah, there's additional layers of protection, the masks, the distancing, some of the protocols. But I think early on, maybe a little bit of push, but everybody seems to have adopted it reasonably well. I think a lot of that comes with some of the positive cases that you see outside of the organization. Positivity rate inside the organization is extremely low, but sometimes it takes a personal relation for it to make it real, so to speak. And we had a lot of very outspoken operators across all of our organizations that had a personal relationship or a personal loved one that allowed that transformation kind of take place a little easier.
Great. Question. Do you believe plant production has been reduced since COVID-19 safety factors? And do you believe plants will return to complete normalcy by the end of 2021?
Fingers are crossed for the end of 2021. What I will say for productivity wise, I would say absolutely not. I think the protocols that we put in place did not alter the overall ability to manufacture tons. I don't think from my start in charter, I think one of the pushes I've always given is I've not been a tons per hour pusher from a productivity standpoint, because as people kind of learn their new rhythm, as with changes, they will get back to find the new best way, the new optimal way to manufacture. The tons per hour will follow suit. We did not see any drop off. I would say we actually, in my specific plants, I have seen an increase in productivity across draw lines, across the cleaning lines. Annealing's pretty steady state, but the functional operations that I manage have actually seen an uptick in productivity.
Super. Next question. I'd love to hear more about the dock lock alternative you are planning to implement.
So I can take that one, Brian. Our typical systems in the past, as many are familiar with, is the dock lock system that you have that hook that comes up to lock into the ICC bar of the truck. We are trying to move away from that. Had 2 trials of systems. One specific name, correct me if I'm wrong, Brian, Right Height Global Wheel Lock System. Both of our systems are physically locking the back wheels in place versus relying on a hook and ICC bar. And we've had great success with these systems. It's taken us a while to get there around conditions, best type of systems, but Right Height Global Wheel Lock System rather is what I believe it's called. And I can forward on that information as well, but a great success there.
Originally we had where we would need 2 of 3 different items in check to be able to secure that dock, whether it's the ICC bar, whether it's the brake, or whether it's chocks themselves. I didn't realize how prevalent it was until you stop and look at how many trucks are driving down the road without ICC bars, how often they actually pull away from docks while still. This system takes that completely out of the question and truly does lock that in. That's why we're cascading that across steel.
Next question. Thank you for sharing. Is the software system self-developed or a packaged program? I think you answered some of this. If packaged, how much modification was required?
So it's our internal system that we've developed. We've had this system since 2015. I went through an evaluation process of selecting a software system versus developing it in-house. Chose to go in-house for a cost benefit, and we manage our own system. So managing the change, we have the ability to manage the change for some of the elements, the categories, the selection, the data, essentially the output as well. So that was an internal change. Now I've benchmarked with other companies that have used software like Intellex, and they've made some changes. I think those changes take longer as you propose changes to a software system that's pretty integrated like Intellex already. But it's all internal, which is beneficial for us, and we continue to enhance and make changes to that system. It's a pretty robust system, so we continue to look at that to enhance and make changes.
Great. Next question. We as a company, along with another 20 platform companies under the same umbrella, are looking and reporting out the potential SIF, both with an injury and as a near miss, with the same vigor as an SIF. Is Charter Steel doing anything similar?
We try. It's probably an area of improvement for us. Just to as I highlighted in the presentation, just as a reminder, we define SIF as actual and potential within our definition. Now we do have subcategories of SIF potential and SIF actual that we monitor and measure as well. So we've tried to push reporting out on SIF regardless of outcome. Now it's important to state if you have a SIF actual that how the employee is doing, or we have to go to the hospital to visit the employee. That's important, absolutely. But we continue to push and get visibility at a higher level around those SIF Ps, so to speak. One highlight that DECRA made when they came back to evaluate our systems after implementation is that they liked how we defined SIF as actual and potential. So I'd say during an operations meeting, someone opens with, hey, we had a SIF, everyone perks up and kind of waits for the result as well. So it's important, but it's probably an opportunity for us as well to have the same vigor, the same corrective action. But it's tough when someone's actually hurt. You're just going to get more visibility, and rightfully so, right?
Next question. How did you determine SIF potential for COVID-19 and rate it at the beginning?
Great. Brian, I don't know. I think it's a great question. We talked about the potential. There's just so many factors. There's so many underlying factors, I believe, that could be a level of different levels of severity. And from what I heard, I talked to an employee yesterday that had returned to work as an example and said, "Hey, Nate, how are you doing?" And he said, "Yeah, I only lost my I had lost the smell and taste for 2 days, and I'm back to work. I'm fine." Now I've heard there's other levels of severity. So the potential is a challenge when you talk about SIF. That's I would say my narrative or my elevator speech on it. So we really haven't, but we've taken it serious, and that's through our auditing process, communication, and so on and so forth. So with our process. So Brian, I don't know if you have any additional comments there.
Yeah, I think the actual veracity of the pandemic affects everybody differently. So we say it's going to be life altering for everybody, but it's definitely life impacting for everybody. Well, the other aspect from a seriousness standpoint was the response we did on day one, meeting literally 6 days a week to try to figure out what the response plan is to control the exposure. How do we protect employees? How do we protect customers? How do we protect the organization? Response plans, reaction plans, redundancy, looking at our key critical skill areas for, if we have a positive, and running drills. Kevin and his team have done a phenomenal job going through and doing scenario training with every single plant to say, okay, you had a positive that went into your supervisor office and just took out 3 supervisors with a close contact. How do you respond as an organization? So from an exposure standpoint, it definitely dovetailed into that SIF potential for us, that risk potential, and how we planned accordingly as an organization to react differently than we did and learn through the last 9 months that we've been managing through this.
Thank you. Next question. Can you detail on how you safety conduct first responder training, specifically CPR?
So we've done online for the first responder certification. We continue to hold on the hands-on CPR portion. So we're looking at the second half of 2021 to catch up with our training there. So first responder is based on the local facility and offerings of online. It depends by plant and by certification type. But yes, we continue to hold on the CPR training.
Next question. I agree that the need for frontline supervisors to be fully engaged with the safety initiatives, as they are the boots on the ground. To implement safety policy, any tips on how to create that safety culture amongst the supervisor group?
For us, we had a lot of candid conversations early on. So even before we started with the training, I know myself and several other ops managers spent a lot of time talking to the frontline leaders about the importance of safety and making it personal. I think every single one of us has a personal safety story, why safety is important to you, and really a safety vision that you want to see for your organization. We had a lot of candid conversations, just roundtable discussions leading into that training on the importance of safety and why we want everybody to go home in as good, if not better condition when they arrived at work. You have myself, I've seen incidents of molten metal on individuals that individual is no longer able to work, and why you don't ever want to see that take place again. Personal testaments. I think if safety is not personal to you, it's going to be hard to, accept, embrace, and drive a safety culture. So I think that's the getting engagement on that frontline leader level. Just my 2 cents. Kevin, I'm not sure if you have.
Well said. Just Just a note on the initiative around safety contacts and supervisors going out on the floor to engage employees in that exposure identification process and building relationships. One thing that is unique in that process for us is that we do what is called a shoulder to shoulder, and it's not just the safety department or a safety coach. It's within that plant management group that performs these shoulder to shoulder with the frontline leaders and gives them feedback on how they're doing. It's also just a demonstration of commitment of time and effort and their expectations as frontline leaders. So I thought it was a unique part of the process, a pretty cool part of the process, and we continue to enhance that as we move forward and build skill and capability at that plant coaching level as well.
Thank you. Next question. It's easy to monitor the physical health of the workforce during COVID-19. What are you doing to keep an eye on the mental health of employees?
Goes back to what Kevin's saying, which is really spending the time, really taking the pauses, making sure that we're still doing our toolbox talks, engaging with the employees, managed by walk around. I know it's COVID time, but you can still walk around. I can still walk a shop floor and talk to the operators about what's going on outside of work and making sure it's a non-work discussion on a lot of these, just to make sure that they, how's your family? How's your family doing? Anything different? And really just continue to engage on that standpoint to try and keep a pulse on where everybody's head's at, so to speak. I think every organization, every employee, ourselves included, COVID, the confines of COVID have enhanced everybody's stress level. So I would say everybody's on some level of pressure, so to speak, from the pandemic. The other thing is really making sure that we do have good programs that if somebody wants to talk to somebody outside of charter, we have employee opportunities there that they can reach out, and really reinforcing that those exist. And if you don't feel comfortable talking to Brian, here's a phone number and here's an opportunity for you to reach out and just talk to somebody about what you're going through. Done a lot from that engagement side of things to try to keep that finger on the pulse of what's going on. And I would also say it's not just the operators. The other aspect is we have a lot of people working remote, and although it seems like an easy task to work remote, it is not. You're disconnected from the culture. You're disconnected from the relationships. So as management and as staff, we've been very intentional to try to make sure we have one-on-one touch bases with all of our teams virtually, not on site, just to make sure that, that we do know you're out there, and really just to having those conversations. That's first and foremost, is that relationship, that trust, that conversation, and making sure that it's not just the inside the plant people that you need to pay attention to, it's everybody in the organization.
Great. We're getting close to the end of our time, but we have a few more questions. Okay, now this is a good one. What is the percentage of SIF/PSIF versus your total recordable incidents? And how do you ensure that SIFs or PSIF lessons are taken by all sites implemented?
So the original assessment by DECRA, we were at 21% SIF across all incidents. We are currently at about 10%. We're down to 10%. Our rate has dropped even greater, but I believe that's because of the reporting of the incidents as well. So percentages for all incidents, so that would be near misses, property damage, all those classifications, is down to 10% SIF, which, just a reminder, includes PSIF and SIF actuals. We've had very few SIF actuals in the last 2 years. Now, communication across all sites, great question. For lessons learned and implementation of corrective and preventive actions, we do a number of things. We share the events and incidents at our operations meetings. We send out those exposure alerts so they can be applied. Also additional communication across those sister plants, as the risk profile is different from a rolling mill to a processing facility, to ensure that we're applying those corrective and preventative actions. And if it warrants, we also identify and document in our iCare system as a follow-up action if it applies to another area. So it has to be implemented across all sites.
Great. Two more questions. The last one will be mine. What is your plan for sustaining these programs in the future?
Yeah, I hit on this briefly. It's about oversight and governance and ensuring that we're keeping focus on those critical programs in the future, using data, using auditing, and using that check and balance at the manager level to ensure that they're functioning properly and healthy as we move forward.
Okay. My question. Any last words of advice to the audience? Because we're all faced with unusual circumstances every day.
Engage your employees. Engage whatever initiative, program, or process you have. Engage your employees. That's my advice. Get their involvement. Go to the grassroots. Make sure they're involved. Make sure you get their feedback. Make sure you follow up. Ensure that you've got management credibility when you're rolling out these type of programs, whether it's directed at COVID or SIF or whatever your focus is. That's my advice.
Say it's the same advice for COVID. Listen, be an ear, go talk to people, have that relationship, let them vent that pent up angst and frustration that everybody's enduring at the moment. And then also temper the expectations of what you want to do. So reprioritize, from an ops standpoint, from an implementation, what's important today for the next 6 months, and really what under the current circumstances do we just defer out, to be honest with you.
Great advice. We could even put that into our personal lives too, I think. Talk to each other and communicate and find out what's important. Well, right now I want to thank Brian and Kevin and Charter Steel for this very informative and interesting presentation. And we really enjoyed it and hope we can twist your arms again maybe next year to come back or at Interwire. We're out of time, so I'd like to take this last opportunity to thank WAI's instructors, its sponsors, and of course, all of those of you who have listened. And also, if you're not a member of the Wire Association and want to have access to the association's full educational offerings, visit www.wirenet.org. And to all of our friends, we wish a safe and happy holiday season. And with that, we'll sign off. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.